So what we'll do today really is we're going to talk a little bit about our work and our research. Language, belonging, and identity are very passionate notions to, I think, all the three of us in different kinds of ways and forms. I'm an academic, and my research really is on migration, on migrants. And I look at migrants from a different kind of perspective. I'm from the School of Media and Communication, so whenever I go to any conference, I'm always the odd one out, because if I go to an education conference, everyone's like, I'm doing curriculum, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, hi, I'm Kat, and I'm from Media and Com. And they look at me and think, you're in the wrong room. The conference on media and communication is like, you're in the next state. So, hey. But in the last few years, I have realized that identity is really important. Who am I? Who do I think I am? Who do others think I am? Affects in the sense of, of belonging. I just finished a project with the Department of Health in Australia, and it was about vaccine uptake, right? So I was looking at culturally and linguistically diverse communities. And in particular, we were looking at Arabic-speaking communities and Chinese-speaking communities in Australia. And so what we wanted to know is whether or not the messages which the Department of Health has been coming out with has been reaching different communities. And so when we started doing our research, we found that these messages were not reaching people. The Arabic-speaking community in particular were really interesting because we had held focus groups where they were telling us that the messages that were coming out from the government, both state and federal, were not reaching them because whoever had that one job to translate didn't do it really well. And so our Arabic speakers were telling us that the messages were coming out not just in Arabic but Farsi, because whoever was translating didn't realize that although the lettering may look the same, they're completely two different languages. So what people did was, and this was so fantastic, grassroots. They created a Facebook page, and then the community started translating government messages so that they are accurate. And then you also have that trust. Though the Australian government then sort of like remedied all this, but what happened was it was an issue about trust. And with the Arabic speakers, everyone I interviewed were also asylum seekers and refugees. So you have this added trauma where you come to a place which you expect is going to treat you better. You have these kind of issues happening. So again, trust becomes really quite interesting. So today we have really a very interesting panel because we have Gillard here, who has a vast amount of experience as an academic, as a traveler, as an individual. And I love the fact that, although he was born in Tel Aviv, he has worked in Singapore, he's now a fellow academic in Australia, he's also really interested in First Nations languages. And First Nations languages in Australia they're dying out. And it's really fascinating to have someone so dedicated to bringing back the languages, because language is so important. Language is about history. Language is about culture. Language is about future, And this is where, his talk is going to be so fascinating. And then we have Terry, who has a wonderful lived experience as not just a man of faith, but a person who helps at an individual level, who helps at a group level. And I've been having the best time talking to these two gentlemen, and the fact that as a woman I'm controlling the both of them really makes me feel powerful in so many different ways you never imagine. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me first invite Professor Gillard Zuckerman to the stage to share his life work with you. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Zuckerman.
Thank you so much, Kat, Shakir, and everybody else who invited me here to Singapore, the Lion City. I always enjoy being here. Language, identity, and belonging. It says here that our session examines how languages shape our perceptions on reality, the evolution of vocabulary, and how words build on our sense of belonging and how we differentiate ourselves from others. I would like to say at the beginning that I like very much John Adams' quotation, "I must study politics and war, that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy." My sons ought to study mathematics, philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture again, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain. I would add, these days, heritage languages, Hokkien, Hakka, Singlish, Adnyamatna, Bangala, these are Aboriginal languages of Australia, and also revivalistics. And this is the book that Shakir mentioned earlier. There was a Jewish American called Abraham Maslow, you all know of him, and he described the hierarchy of needs in 1943. Of course, there was no battery and Wi-Fi at the time. But if I ask you where most hoi polloi, so the masses, the normies, I'm not talking about the elite, I'm not talking about the people who are sitting here, I'm talking about hoi polloi, the normies, the masses. I guess that most normies would be in the thirds of belonging, love. How many do you know who reach self-esteem, let alone self-actualization? It's extremely rare to find people in this world today who have reached their Ikigai. Ikigai, this Japanese raison d'être concept, it's the interface between what you're good at, what the world needs, what you love, and what you're paid for. I have a friend who is a guitarist. He loves what he does, he's good at it, the world needs it. Absolutely, he's not paid for it. And on the other hand, I have an accountant friend. He's paid for it, the world needs it still. He's good at it. Does he love it? He doesn't love it. Sorry for the generalization. I believe that the current technological revolution, which is one of the 4 linguistic revolutions so far in the world, and I will describe the 4 linguistic revolutions in a second, will make people go up the basic human needs hierarchy of Maslow. So there will be more hoi polloi, more masses going up the ladder, so to speak. Now, the technological revolution will turn people from seeking things, this is where we are currently at, to seeking ideas. Just as the Industrial Revolution turned people from seeking food to seeking things. As you know, 90% of your ancestors were farmers. 90%. These days, maybe 4% are farmers. This is because of the Industrial Revolution. The technological revolution is also a huge revolution. Now, the technological revolution is this 20th century to present revolution of mass media, CNN, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, the fact that you can now watch us in theory anywhere in the world if it's live, etc. But I need to say that there were 4 linguistic revolutions so far that changed the world, and they're all very relevant to this conference of cohesive societies. The first revolution, which happened more than 70,000 years ago, was speaking. It allowed Homo sapiens sapiens to lie about the past and the future, something that animals cannot do. The other thing, it allowed us to offend without any physical violence, something that animals cannot do. It's a huge revolution. The second revolution is writing. And what is interesting here is that it was an economically driven revolution. It was established by people whose wheat was stolen when they sent it from, say, Baghdad to Israel, and they received half of the salt back. It turned out after investigation that there were some thieves on the way that took the wheat. So next time they wrote 4 units of wheat. This is the beginning of writing. As it happens, most languages in the world do not have writing, traditionally. I'm dealing with Aboriginal languages in Australia, 400 languages. Only 12 of them are alive and kicking, 3%. 97% were killed by linguicide. None of these languages had a writing, but the writing system which emerged in Iraq, in Mesopotamia, 5,200 years ago, allowed Homo sapiens sapiens to protect himself from thieves. Type printing, Johannes Gutenberg in 1450 develops the first European movable type printing press, enabling mass production of books and mass religious conversion. Without this revolution, it had its Chinese parallel developments. We would have not been able to have a Bible everywhere in the world. And this is our current technological revolution that I was talking about. Language is an archaeological vehicle full of the remnants of dead and living pasts, lost and buried civilizations and technologies. The language we speak is a whole palimpsest of human effort and history. Palimpsest, as you know, is when you take a papyrus, which is written already, but you use it to write something else. In Thessaloniki, in Greece, I found some Jewish tombstones that were reused as some kind of bricks for playfield. So I could see that it was written here, was buried, but it was a part of a building. So this is also some kind of a palimpsestic existence. Let me tell you about language revival. Language revival needs resources, even though most languages that you revive are not written traditionally. So you need resources, you need resilience. If you know anything about Muhammad Ali was there for the long run. So he was not a Rambo or a Marziano who just kind of knocks you out. He was an athlete. With language reclamation, with the resurrection of sleeping beauty tongues, or dreaming beauty tongues, as I call them in Australia, because of the idea of dreaming or dream time, Jukurpa, among Aboriginal Australians, you need to go there for the long run. It's not like a kiss that you give the sleeping beauty and it kind of resurrects. It has to do with well-being. It has to do with religious missionaries who came to Australia, in this case in 1838, in order to Christianize the Aboriginal people. Klammer Wilhelm Schumann from Osnabrück in Germany. He was from the Dresden Lutheran Mission. And this is a connection that I have with Terry because I'm using Lutheran missionaries' dictionaries. Terry is a Lutheran leader. And he wrote this dictionary in order to assist him with the Christianization of the Aboriginal people. We use these dictionaries in order to reconnect with the original Aboriginal spirituality. So it's a very beautiful, symmetric righting the wrong of the past, because we use the very dictionary written for missionary activities for Aboriginal spirituality resurrection. Another righting the wrong of the past that is symmetric is that technology killed Aboriginal languages, not only in Australia. Everywhere you look in the New World, and even in the Old World, but everywhere you look at the New World, you see languages being killed, whether it's Te Reo Maori in Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud, also known by some Maori as the land of the wrong white crowd. Wrong white crowd, long white cloud. If you look at, say, African countries, if you look at Brazil, Argentina, etc., you see a plethora of languages that have been linguicided, killed. We use technology that killed these languages. Think of ships, weapons, think of the black cars that took Harry Dare from his mother. Harry Dare is there, features in this photo. And we use technology in the form of apps, so you can all download this Bangara Aboriginal language app. It's free. We use it in order to reconnect with the language. So this is a symmetric righting the wrong of the past using technology. This is, by the way, Howard Richards with the blue shirt and the black jacket. He was stolen from his mother. This is called the stolen generations. You know that in China sometimes you hear about a child who was kidnapped, but this was for economic reasons or whatever. In Australia, it was a governmental activity. So it's not kind of a criminal or, this is Bangla, speaking Bangla together. Why on earth should we invest time and money in reviving dead languages? For ethical, aesthetic, and utilitarian reasons. Ethical, this is why I do what I do. That's the right thing to do. Aesthetic, because we are human beings. We love beauty as well. Utilitarian is the link to our conference. Language, identity, and well-being. I would like to argue today that language revival results in improved well-being, which facilitates social harmony and social cohesion. I would like to argue the opposite of what many people in the world argue, that everybody should speak the same one language, and then there will be no wars. You've heard this argument, I'm sure, a lot. Every time I hear it, I tell people just Google Rwanda 1994. Rwanda 1994, the massacres took place by people who spoke the very same language. Just Google Syria 2019, massacres taking place by people who speak the very same language. So whoever tells me that if we all speak only one language and only one language, then our world will be a peaceful world, cohesive world, totally unfounded. In my own view, every person should have 4 mother tongues. It's a little bit like the Singaporean 4 official languages, except that my 4 mother tongues are not the same as, Tamil, Malay, Mandarin, and English, but rather you should have your own heritage language. So in the case of Lee Kuan Yew, it would be Hakka, for example. Hakka is not Mandarin. You should have your national language, which I guess in the academic, well, I don't know what to say, what's the national language? I mean, the anthem in Singapore is in Malay. So Malay is actually the first national language. When my friends went to the army, they told me that left, right, left in Singapore is in Malay. It's not left, right, left in English, which is, I think, genius, because when I went to the Israeli army, it was in Hebrew. It was not in Arabic, for example. The third language you should have is the international language. So in the case of academia, it is currently American, or say English. And the fourth language you should have as your mother tongue has to do with your Ikigai, with your raison d'être. Why are you, if you're an opera singer, maybe it should be Italian, even though you're Singaporean, or even though you're Australian, etc. So this is just an obiter dictum, or just by the way. I would like to very quickly go through these 3 answers: ethical, aesthetic, and utilitarian reasons for language revival. And I will, of course, end with the utilitarian reason, because the utilitarian reason is what this is about, this conference, the well-being. There are many related questions, but I'm not going to answer them today, unless some people have questions about them. I would like to we would like to leave a lot of time for questions and discussions and complaints. I will just tell you that language revival is all over the world. It's not just in Australia. Here, this is in South Africa, this is in Namibia, Jumwasi, this is in Thailand. It's endless. What Kat said about traveler, actually, I've never defined myself as a traveler, but it's true, because when you reclaim languages, you have to travel a lot. So I've been to 100 countries, which is more than half of the countries. There are still many countries to go to. If you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart, says Nelson Mandela. The language you see in the background, you know what it is, right? It's Hebrew. The loss of language, in my view, is more severe than the loss of land. I believe that language is more important than the specific land where you are born into. Language death means loss of cultural autonomy, loss of intellectual sovereignty, loss of spirituality, loss of well-being, loss of mental health, loss of your soul. The natives would be sooner civilized if their language was extinct, says Anthony Forster, an Australian colonist, financier, and politician. This is language killing, linguicide. And this is why we ought to spend time and money in reclaiming sleeping Aboriginal languages, 97%. Australia ought to learn from New Zealand and from Singapore. Singapore has 4 official languages, New Zealand has 2, Te Reo Māori, and the second one is, no, English is not de facto. Say it again? Sign languages. I know, it's Te Reo Māori and sign language, 2. English is not de jure. So the answer is only 2 languages. Did you get it, yeah? I said there are only 2 official languages in New Zealand. Paul, my friend, said there are 3. Not because he's wrong, because English is de facto, but it's not de jure. And this is exactly what Australia should do. Australia should define 401 official languages without English. The one should be the sign language of deaf people. Exactly like New Zealand. That's very interesting because when somebody argued that English is de facto official language, I wrote a letter to Bill English, who was a prime minister, and he returned and said, okay, I'm sorry, we made a mistake in the website, and they changed the website because it's not de facto. It's not de jure, it's de facto. Okay. Look, the aesthetics are very simple. When you lose a language, you lose a culture, intellectual wealth, a work of art. It's like dropping a bomb on a museum, the Louvre. That's Ken Hale. Look how beautiful, diversity. You might be lactose malabsorbent. Look how beautiful. Look how ugly. That's Australia today. Monolingual, just like, well, New Zealand, mostly monolingual, unfortunately. Most New Zealanders are monolingual. America, most Americans are monolinguals despite Spanish. Australia, most Australians are monolingual. This is the monolingual mindset. Look how beautiful. That's your humble servant with Mo One Way, Karen Mock. She was 16. She's a famous singer for those of you who know. Now, I want to go to, from aesthetics, because we don't have time, I want to go to the final point, and this is the point about, no, language and reality. Maybe we will have time later, but not now, because I want Terry to go. But I want now to go to utilitarian benefits, health and well-being. In my 30 years of experience with language revival, first analyzing my own mother tongue, which is revived Hebrew, I call it Israeli. It's a mishmash, it's a hybrid between Yiddish and Hebrew. On the one hand, it's a phoenix rising from the ashes, that's Hebrew. On the other hand, it's a cuckoo laying its eggs in the nest of another bird, tricking it to believe that it is its own offspring. This is Yiddish, the language of the Eastern European Jews. On the other hand, it's a magpie stealing from Arabic, stealing from American, from German, from Italian, etc. So it's a Finnic cuckoo cross with some magpie characteristics. This is Israeli, my mother tongue. In my 30 years of language revival activities, I have noticed that language revival results in a personal, mental, spiritual, and physical well-being. It gives the revivalists and the people whose language is revived a sense of pride and self-esteem. It's an antidote for self-loathing. This is an email from Jenna, an Aboriginal woman. Personally, I found the experience of learning a language liberating and went home feeling very overwhelmed because we were finally going to learn our own language. It gave me a sense of identity. And I think if the whole family learned a language, then we would all feel totally different about ourselves and each other, because it's almost like it gives you a purpose in life. This is Jenna. Another one is Evelyn. A big thank you on behalf of our family here in Port Lincoln. Our ancestors are happy. Our ancestors are happy in Aboriginal culture means they are happy, the people who say that. So the final comment that I have is about this linguicide resulting in suicide. So Darcy Hallett, Michael Chandler, and Christopher Lalonde in 2007 found out that in British Columbia, Canada, there is a clear correlation between youth suicide and lack of conversational knowledge in the native language. They looked at 6 tribes, Aboriginal tribes of Canada. You know that Aboriginal people, this is the name for native people in Canada as well. And the one that lost its language had a very high level of suicide, youth suicide. The one who never lost their language had no suicide, and then the 4 others were exactly correlating like that. My own argument, language revival, improved well-being. Just as language loss increases suicidal ideation and depression, language gain reduces ill mental health and empowers the well-being of the people involved in the revival as well as their associates. I think that I will end up here and then talk later if there are questions. How about that?
Thank you so much for that, Gillard. I think what was really interesting about what you're talking about as well is, you're talking about indigenous, and interestingly enough, even with indigenous, there are different kinds of names as well. We started off during colonization in Australia with Aboriginal, and then it became rude words, where people who are racist decreased it to the first 3 letters of the word Aboriginal, and then we changed to indigenous. And then now we're talking about First Nations. And that's really interesting because when we think about First Nations, we don't just think about Australia. We also think about other countries that have been colonized and how First Nations now use this term to describe themselves because they were the first in a particular place. And this is where issues of language and place are so important, especially coming from Israel as well, where there is a passion that I can feel coming from you of this notion of place and language. So that's really such a fascinating and increasingly important area of research as well as understanding. And I'm so excited as well now to welcome Terry Kee. Terry is a bishop, and I'm so happy to actually call someone who is a man of faith by his first name. That's a privilege for me, coming as a Catholic girl, going to school, Catholic church. And Terry, interestingly enough, is talking about migrants, which is a lot of my research is around. So, we talk about language, we talk about people who are First Nations, and now we also talk about people who come to places where language is so important because they come to new places to find hope, where sometimes language becomes difficult for them in terms of finding a sense of belonging. Because as what Gillard was saying, what happens is that countries like Australia have only one language, monolingual, and if you don't know that language and know it well, without the accents, then you stand out, you are an outlier, and you are made to feel less of a belonged person. And we're really excited for Terry to actually speak about this. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bishop Terry Kee.
Good afternoon. Are you still awake? Well, to be very honest, I was a bit puzzled why they asked me, a religious personnel, to speak on non-religious subject. Then I realized that perhaps all those 3 things were very close to my heart and very much a part of me. With so many hats that I wear, that sometimes I wonder, who am I? And of course, sometimes you say, you are Terry Kee, or sometimes it's Terry Kee Bak Hwa. But when my wife called me Terry Kee, I know I'm in trouble. And you say Terry Kee Bak Hwa, I know I'm in deep trouble. All right? Now, firstly, a brief introduction to myself. I grew up speaking Teochew at home, Hokkien with neighbors, but the kind of Hokkiens I spoke with my neighbors are usually those that you speak when you fight or when you quarrel. Watching Hong Kong Cantonese dramas, learned Malay as the national language in Banbury School, but that was stopped when I was in Banbury 3. So some of you can guess how old or how young am I. And then Mandarin as a second language. And to be very honest, I didn't do very well with my second language. After I left school, after I began my ministry as a pastor, I had an encounter with someone that perhaps many Singaporeans know, Dr. Chung Chipang. We were at a camp. And in the evening, this was in Malaysia, the camp was in Malaysia, the English-speaking pastors went to town to look for durian. And the Chinese pastors, they stayed behind writing calligraphy, drinking Chinese tea, and they were talking to one another. I'm not that keen on durian, and they have money to go shopping, so I stayed with them. And Dr. Chung began to engage me and talk to me in Chinese, in Mandarin. And at that point of time, my Mandarin was not so good, so I struggled to answer him fluently. And he turned to me and he said this, Terry, as a Chinese, you can't even speak Chinese properly. Aren't you ashamed of yourself? I almost said no. You guess what would happen if I say no, but I just kept quiet. And of course, English in school. And later in life, I learned Thai and did part of my master in divinity in Thai. And the reason was because serving in Thailand, like what Dr. Gillard said, if you speak the language they understand, you speak to their mind. But if you can speak in their language, you speak to their heart. And that's why I took the effort to learn that. But the thing about my inefficiency in Chinese disturbed me. So I completed my master in Taiwan, and I did it in Mandarin. And unexpectedly, after my 12 years as bishop, when I stepped down, my successor asked me, what would you do now? I said, well, according to the need of the church, and they make me the pastor of a Chinese-speaking congregation. And I've got no choice but to really brush up my Chinese. Now, that is a little bit about language experiences. And so I had experiences of struggling with a new language, trying to understand. I have experiences of being in a context of let me put it this way, Chinese may be the majority race in Singapore, but I've been in situations where I seated around the table, I was the only Chinese and the rest are Malays. And so I was a minority there. And how awkward I felt when halfway through the conversation in the language that is commonly known, they began to speak to each other in Malay, and I was wondering what they were saying. Are they talking about me? All right. And I learned that I need to be sensitive, that when there's a non-Chinese or non-Thai there, and if you need to engage in a conversation that is not their language, I think we should have the sensitivity to offer them translation so that they are included. So that is this thing about belonging and language. And according to Santo Anand, actually the full name is Santo Anand Singh, an academic from India, he said that a person's belongingness was embodied by their presence in and involvement with social groups in their social system. Belongingness was experienced when an individual felt acknowledged, indispensable, value, and integral within those social groups. Self-acceptance of their own membership of a social group and the feeling of being accepted by other members were critical. In other words, you felt belong and they accepted you as belonging to them. And you realize that for that to happen, language and identity are key in building one's sense of belonging. So now we come to, you see, so language is important in order to feel a sense of connection and belonging to oneself, to others, to a country. But learning a new language is not just about learning a language. It's about taking the whole culture, a whole new culture, and everything that entails. I really learned and appreciate this when I began to learn Thai, because it's a very beautiful language, and through the language you begin to realize how they think, how they operate, and why, if you meet a Thai person, within a few sentences of the conversation, they would like to ask you, how old are you? Don't feel offended, because they want to know how to properly respect you and address you and not to offend you. All right, so, and so in learning the language, you begin to realize that, hey, for the Thais, it's very impolite to just address people by your first name. You must always have a something prefix before, and that could be P, it could be Nong, it could be Lung, it could be Na, it could be A. What it means is, the P, that means older brother or sister, Nong is younger brother or sisters, A or Na, that means someone that's an uncle or an auntie but younger than your parents. Pa or Lung is someone that's older than your parents. All right, and that's why for them, the whole culture and address and conversation, they want to assess how to relate to you, and so they will ask, I hope you don't mind, how old are you? All right, I've passed the age and I forgot how old am I. You may think I'm not that young or I'm not that old, but actually I'm older than many people realize. Just that naturally, by the grace of my mother, whom in her 80s and her hair is still naturally black. And so you can count it. My mother is late 80s, so how? Okay, we'll you'll do that. All right, and identities, simply stated, is who are you, as Catherine had mentioned just now. And most have an identity that are defined by their cultural classification, nationality, race, religion, and gender, as well as societal characteristics like family, career, and position or title. So sometimes some people, they are so closely identify themselves to maybe their title, they were minister, they were manager, they were something, and then when they were no longer that, they had the identity crisis. If that was all that is to them of who they are. And for some of us, we wear so many hats that sometimes we have to remind ourselves, what hat am I wearing, and in what position should I be responding to them? And in a way that is acceptable. And very often in trying to belong, we try to find common areas, common pointers, all right? And so we try to find out, where are you from? Oh, for example, when we converse, you say, oh, I was from Adelaide. I say, hey, the Lutheran Church in Australia, the head office was in Adelaide, and I've been there many times, and we can talk about something in common, and so as to build connections. And you realize that someone is a Teochew here and can start to speak in Teochew. And then someone will say, but they are all dialects, isn't it? Teochew, Hokkien, Cantonese, Mandarin, and are they similar? Many Singaporeans will know that it's not so similar. All right, to give you an example, for example, a simple sentence of where are you going? Teochew, the Teochew people, Lekatiko. All right, Teochew, Lekatiko. Cantonese, the Yohipinto. Any similarities? Mandarin, Niaochi Nali. All right? So they are, in a way, in the early days, rightly considered to be perhaps even languages of their own right, who had even their own writings. But now, because of the great emperor, Shi Huangdi, who burned away all the books of different languages, and with a united written language, we can use the one written language to express all the different spoken languages. All right, so these are languages. And not only are we talking about spoken language or written language or sign language. And we realized that even with sign languages, same sign in different culture could mean different thing. There are many examples. Maybe I just give you one simple one. You know, there was a story too of this man who went to another country. I won't mention the name of the country, but they have different skin color, and so he was clearly seen as a foreigner in that land. He was with his backpack, and he was hitchhiking. So what he did, he was trying to, you know, this is what you do. I think many of us here in Asia will recognize that. And so when he saw a pickup coming by, he was so excited, he stood up and he began to do this. The pickup stopped, he ran towards them, a few guys got off the pickup and they beat him up. And he did not know why. He was admitted to the hospital, the police came to make a statement, and he said, I had no reason, no idea why did they beat me up. And then the police said, what did you do? No, I was only hitching a ride. I was only doing this. And the police said, that is the reason. Because that, in their context, is a bad sign. All right? It's, in fact, a vulgar sign. All right? And to those people on the pickup, you are a guest to our country, and you do this to us, and they beat him up. And so when you are in another culture, in another context, whether it's spoken, same language, but same language can have different connotations and meaning in different places. It can be same sign, but it can mean different thing. And there's room for misinterpretation. I give one quick one. You know, my wife and myself, we were in Thailand learning the Thai language, and we understood. And sometimes we realized that understanding the actual meaning of the word, you may not really understand what they are saying. Let me give an example. We were traveling long distance across the country, and suddenly the driver said, in others, I'm going to shoot rabbits, who is interested? And the guys put up the hand, and they stopped the car, and they got out of the car, and my wife said, with what do you shoot? Can I see? And they ought to know, and say, no. Do you know what they mean by shooting rabbits? They are going to pee beside the road. So they will stop the car near a bushy area. And my wife will say, can I see? All right, so again, there are languages that you need to know and understand and communicate, and you can joke about it and then be really identified with them. All right? And personally, I felt that Singapore's effort to try to forge an identity and to build a sense of belonging, while language is not the only thing that they did, but it was one of the big things that they did. The bilingual policy, whereby at that point of time, actually now, in fact, I just heard something recently that they are a bit more liberal now. But what I'm saying here is that at the point of time, they think of one thing, Singapore, in order for us to be united, we need a language that we can all communicate with each other between the races. But if you force that language on everybody, and that is the only language, then they will get a strong pushback. Because the Malay will not tolerate the loss of the Malay, the Chinese will not tolerate the loss of the Chinese, and the others, over a language that is foreign to them, actually. And so they come with a simple idea of having two languages everybody must have, one common language for all, and one your own mother tongue. And some of us will argue that that's not my mother tongue was Hokkien. All right, but among the Chinese, that is in a way the written language of the Chinese. And same thing for the Indian community. Some will say, oh, I'm a Gujarat. My mother tongue is Gujarati. All right, or my mother tongue is Tamil Nadu, is the Kerala. All right, or Telugu, sorry, I said wrongly. Telugu is Telugu. All right, it's not Tamil. But at the point of time, they make use of perhaps the largest Indian community who speaks that, and use that as the language. And of course, for the others, you may be able to do that at home, and that's why I grew up speaking Teochew at home, Hokkien with my neighbors, watching Cantonese movie, because in those days, the only country that is producing a lot of Chinese movie were from Hong Kong, and no effort was done to dub them. It was dubbed only in later years. All right, and that's how we grew up in that kind of context. And so a language that we can be in touch with our own culture, our own identity of who we are as a Chinese Singaporean, but yet a common language for us to forge a sense of belonging among us here. All right? And what I've heard was that I think I just read the announcement that starting from this month, all right, they allow dialect to be written in your ID. In other words, in the past, it was only like Chinese or Indian or Malay in your identity card. But as of this month, they allow you to put there as a Hokkien Chinese or Teochew Chinese or Cantonese Chinese. Because they recognize that while they're all Chinese, there are certain distinctiveness, something whereby they can feel that is a part of them, and there's a tradition, a history, and a culture that they can treasure and be in touch with. And again, this forge. And I guess it requires certain confidence of who you are to be able to embrace others without fear of losing yourself. All right? And I guess we have come to a place whereby we have reached a certain level of comfort that they are willing to say beyond identification as the Malay, Indian, or Chinese, you are able to identify yourself. And some of you might be able to, I do not know if they allow you to do that, Javanese Malay or whatever Malay, because even Malay is a collective. All right, even the Indians is collective, so that we can have a sense of pride of who we are and where we come from. And so besides policies and the willingness of oneself to learn and to connect, as well as the willingness of others to welcome and include you, all right, that is important. All right, so because of my desire to be able to connect, I intentionally learn another language so I can connect with them. But of course, it is also important for the others to accept me and to include me and to welcome me. And so on our side, where they are the guests, the question we ask ourselves is, are we willing to be welcoming, accepting, and embrace them with all their differences? And we hope that the other will embrace us in spite of all our differences. And all together, we are all the more the richer. And so some of the personal experience and observation of being inclusive is, as I mentioned earlier on, I had a feeling of being excluded when the conversation suddenly went on in a language I do not know. And I believe all of us had that experience too. And I want to say sorry to my Malay friends and the Indian friends and others, because I've done that a lot until I experienced the other side of it. Then I became to be more careful to, even if I cannot speak in your language, at least the language that you understand, so that you are included in the conversation. And then being respectful. Seek to understand the culture of the others so as not to offend unnecessarily due to wrong salutation or words. I did not realize that it was so complicated. When you are in Thailand, in Thai, even the way you refer to yourself, different way of referring, we are talking to different people. And to use the wrong, sometimes can be, the wrong term can be regarded as a mark of disrespect. So how do we learn to be sensitive to give them the right respectful salutation, the right address, and also the way of, the kind of using the same word that they can understand and appreciate. And do not be too quick to take offense when someone says something or do something that is considered disrespectful in your culture. because they may not know or realize that that is disrespectful. All right, so all I'm asking for is learn to be sensitive, learn to be more open-hearted and more forgiving, and do not be too quick to assume that they are intentionally trying to provoke you or offend you. So thank you very much. God bless you.
Oh, thank you so much, Terry, for that really very interesting and very personal relationships that you have with language. When you were talking about being in a situation where other people speak a different language, like I'm Eurasian, so English is my first and last language. And I used to study Bahasa in primary school and secondary school and junior college when I was living in Singapore, because my parents thought that it was easier for me to understand the Roman script. It turned out I was really, really bad. And now I can only order something in Bahasa at the hawker center, and that's about it. But what you really sort of like said was how language is so important in terms of not just feeling a sense of belonging, but also its communication. I think one of the things that we haven't really touched on, but you have both explained in different kinds of ways, is how language is important, how in terms of how we talk to each other. You know, all of us here, you have that first, that single language that we all have a commonality, which is English, right? But at the same time, the way that we speak English, the way that we understand English is very different. The accents make a very very important, that has a very important role to play. When I first came back to Singapore, I brought my husband with me, and he's Australian, and we came out at Changi Airport, and we went to a cab, and my Singlish, I tell you, came out like nobody's business one. And he looked at me and thought, dear God, she's having a stroke. Because he couldn't, and it was so alien to him. He knew that I was speaking in English, but he wasn't quite sure whether it was English or not. And part of that for me was so that I feel a sense of belonging coming back home. And also the person I'm talking to can understand what I'm saying as well. So I guess, and we'll open the floor to a few questions. But I just wanted to ask the both of you, what are your thoughts about language and communication, and how does that have a role to play in a sense of belonging? So maybe, Gillard, could we start with you?
I definitely think that language evolved because of the need to communicate. I think that this is the basis for language. However, just as I said earlier, that writing evolved because of economic reasons, resulting in John Coetzee, my friend, or Shakespeare. Language is a mode of communication, but it has reached such an essence which is far beyond communication. So when people feel, some people when they hear a language, they start crying because it reminds them of, say, their grandparents or so definitely language and communication are very important, and I'm not overlooking it, but I think that because there is a tendency among hoi polloi to see language as the only goal of language is to communicate, then it looks as if, the pendulum, at least in my case, is that, no, it has much more than that. So, but I definitely agree that everybody should understand one language in common. English is my 13th language. And I think that it's very good that Singapore has one language that everybody understands. I'm not against it. But I think it's over-applied. I think that it's not such a big deal if people do not speak the same language. You have so many other possibilities. Yeah, that's where I come from.
because of time, I did not go into some of those things that I was doing. Let me just share with you one thing. I was called upon to counsel a couple. The husband is Singaporean, the wife is Thai. And they are having some problem, and they said one of their problems is they cannot even quarrel properly. Because the husband had very few words of Thai, and even English was not so much, and he's Chinese speaking, and the wife had very little Chinese or English. And so how do they communicate? And because of that misunderstanding, small issue became a big issue. And when they realized that I can understand both their languages, wow, suddenly it's like the dam broke and she started to sob and tell what happened. And then I tried to translate to him what were the things that was in her heart. And then he said, I never heard her say this before. I never heard her express that before. The thing is, she said, why should I do that if he can't even understand in the first place? And she cannot do that in her language. All right, and so languages is important for communication. And language and communication is important to overcome miscommunication and also to build relationship and to build bond. It is almost impossible to build a deep relationship if there is no means of communication. And one of the important means certainly is language.
I feel really unworthy knowing that this is your 13th language. I can't even speak Bahasa, my second language, after learning for 10 years. So this is really unworthy. And Terry, you brought up really good points about how language, communication, relationships, and also back to what you were saying earlier on about well-being, because well-being is so important. Your well-being means that your ability to also express when you are hurt, when you're angry. Now, I'm just wondering, what about you guys? Now it's your turn. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts about what was spoken today? And what you can have comments, you have questions. This is a safe space, by the way. We're all friends here. And so we, as a panel as well, we would love to hear your thoughts about language, your thoughts about identity, your thoughts about belonging, how all three connect, how all three even disconnect as well. So we'll open the floor to you first. Is there anyone who would love to come up and share your thoughts or even ask a question? And again, safe space with quite thick skin so we can answer anything.
Yes. Do you have another mic for her? Or? Yeah. Oh, yes, the mic is going her way. The mic is going her way.
Ladies and gentlemen, shall we welcome to the floor? And maybe when you ask a question, tell us your name, where you're from, and just say hi.
Okay, I'm Pek Hoon. I'm local, a Singaporean. I don't have a question, but I do have some thoughts on language. Okay, I'm considered the second or third generation in Singapore, and I go through the process that Terry shared, a common language to communicate as official language, and I learn my Chinese or Mandarin or dialect as my communication at home. But I'm very, find it very difficult to understand. My parents-in-law who are over 80 years old, my mother who are over 80 years old, they can't speak English, but they have a deep, a deep sense of Singaporean identity, a deep sense of belonging in Singapore. So I find no answer to this, but I just thought, how do they cultivate that sense of belonging, that sense of identity, where they could be the first generation or second generation in Singapore? Yeah, thank you.
Just now, I mentioned that language is an important part, but not the only part. And for the first generation migrant, as I recall my grandfather, for example, they suffered. They were, life was tough, difficulties, and it's like hopeless situation, and they came here. And it was here where they were able to earn a living. Here they were able to raise a family, and here, they were given that opportunity and sometimes that sense of gratitude that they are able to settle here is very strong, especially, and I think in many of those countries where the refugees were, they go into another place, whereby they are welcome, they were accepted, and they have the opportunity, all right, to come out of their poverty. Many of these people, actually, as they grow up, they find ways to return back to the society. We know of some people who make it big, and they donate schools and hospitals and all. Of course, they have the means to, but again, it was because when they first came to Singapore, they have nothing but a small little the carrier bag with their clothing, and next to nothing, and they were able to make it, and so they see that as giving back towards a sense of gratitude for what they had gained from this country. So that is one. Another thing about the identity here is I think our Prime Minister recognized that if you have got asset here that you can identify with, that you can truly call it yourself, your own. And that's why they go into that whole system of making it easy for Singaporeans to own your housing, your flats. For those who are not familiar, from your retirement fund scheme, when you are able to accumulate about 10% of the cost of the flat, you can apply for one and pay for the down payment totally from your, we call it the CPF, your Central Provident Fund. When you got your flat, you can pay the monthly installment from your retirement fund because they see having an asset is important for you in your preparation for your retirement. And so because of that, many people own some asset here at practically, they don't have to stinge from their pocket to pay, but it was from their retirement fund that they were able to. And because they own a home that they call their own, they begin to see that this is their home. And then the community, that's where language come in. Either firstly, the larger community of the nation and the smaller community of your race and the community of your family. And I think all of this contributed to our sense of identification and also belonging to the nation.
So did you understand what language your parents speak?
Yeah, she said Chinese, but Mandarin and English, but then it's another dialect.
When your parents speak among themselves, what do they speak?
Dialect.
Which one?
My parents now speak Hakka.
Yes.
And my own parents speak Hokkien.
Hokkien. So I just, maybe I'm missing something. You asked us how come do they feel Singaporean although they do not speak English? But I just don't understand the presupposition that you had. For me, Hakka and Hokkien are among the most Singaporean languages. And therefore, I just don't understand where you're coming from. Because, I mean, Lee Kuan Yew spoke Hakka. Hokkien is the most common Chinese language. It's not a dialect, it's a language in Singapore. So most Chinese Singaporeans come from Hokkien background. Correct me if I'm wrong. I would be very happy to stand corrected. Your parents speak Hokkien and Hakka. Therefore, linguistically speaking, there is no problem whatsoever. They are the most Singaporean people that you can find. The fact that they do not speak English has very little to do, in my view, with the Singaporean identity. So, I mean, if you told me that your parents were, say, Brazilians who moved to Singapore and they have nothing to do with it, then I would, and they still feel Singaporean, then I would have said, okay, that's very interesting, that's very unique. But your parents are Hakka Hokkien.
Of course, we do recognize, that the official language, so now the television, they only have a program in Mandarin, Malay, Tamil, or English. And so when they turn on, they may not understand half of what they are hearing.
And therefore, what we said earlier, both Terry and I, was that when I talk about the 4 languages you need to know, I'm actually referring to your Hakka Hokkien. I'm not referring to Mandarin.
Yeah, I shared that my thoughts was because in my generation, especially those, because my parents are not educated, they come from the age that they didn't go through education. So I thought to have that sense of identity, to have that sense of belonging to a country, I need to understand the policy that's implemented here, to understand the policies that affects me. And I think they don't really understand the policies and the whatever processes, measure that is put in place. But how come they still have that strong sense of identity? My children, who are English educated at the age of about 20, and that sense of identity in the youth are not strong compared to my parents. They have English as the common language, actually. But they are telling me I want to move overseas, I want to move to UK, I want to move to Australia, and yeah. So there's this, yeah.
I think you brought up a really good point about identity, where we're always looking for who we are. And sometimes you have to go out to find out who you really are. I grew up as a minority in Singapore, as Eurasian, and I always wanted to be Chinese because I felt no sense of belonging. Then I went to Australia. I realized there's a lot of minorities where a lot of people feel this lacking of belonging and so on. But things that I look at as, I dealt with my minority issues in Singapore, and so I tend to now look at identity and belonging from a different kind of like perspective, and a perspective where it's not a deficit model, and it should never be a deficit model, but actually as a model of agency. And I think that even as researchers, we need to actually look at things in this perspective, like you were saying, Pat, it's a really good point. You're still trying to identify, and you're trying to also try to figure out. And the fact that you are also expressing for your parents, shows a kind of strong sense of filial piety as well, which is really part of that Singapore identity and part of what, so many of us who are Singaporean, who are Asian, who come from cultures which are very ancient as well. Where parents, family, community, on the broader sense, is so important and very much part of our DNA. So thank you for that. That was really fascinating. Thank you, Patricia.
I just want to add one more thing, and that is, your parents, although not educated and all, grew up in the community, go to the market, the neighbors, and that is their community, and that's all that they know, and that's how they felt at home. Your children, the whole world is their community, and they are connected through the social media and all of this, and so they see the whole world as their community, and then why should I be stuck here and I can be there? You see, and that's one difference that whereby your parents do not have.
Oh, thank you for that, everyone. Yes, we have the gentleman in yellow and then the lady. Selamat petang.
Secondly, I greeted you in Maori. I'm originally born in Malaysia. Thank you. Originally, I was born in Malaysia and went to study in New Zealand, and chosen to live in New Zealand. In 1986, when I went to New Zealand, on the radio, they were saying that te reo, the language, Maori language, was dying, and there was no full-blooded Maori. And also they were talking about kohanga reo, childhood education. 30 plus years on, I've got a question at the end of it, but 30 plus years on, there were 2 teachers teaching children Maori. 30 plus years, we have got 2,000 teachers teaching children Maori. Maori is the official language, and in New Zealand, all our correspondence can be in Maori, and people are expected to understand that. We do not translate in English when we speak in Maori, because it is the official language. It is growing, right? But we talked about linguicide, killing of a language. In 1858, the colonizers in New Zealand made law that you cannot speak in Maori. Right? It has taken 170 odd years for a family to regain that language. I just want to ask this question, given that context as an example, I'd like to ask this question. and they are not related. There are two parts to it, but I'm not sure if they are related. What role has decolonization has in this? And second, how does phonetics help in learning a language?
Yeah, thank you. Te reo Māori, which, as it happens, I mentioned earlier, is a fascinating case because what you see these days in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is more and more dialects of Maori being resurrected. So there was a standardization before the linguicide and after the linguicide. So linguicide, as you've said, the New Zealand government tried to kill Maori, and in fact, there was a period in which it was very hard to find a 40-year-old Maori speaker. You could either find somebody like Patu Hohepa or Timothy Karetu, like old people, or you would find young people who are going to Kohanga Reo, as you said, to study Maori as a revived language, but you couldn't find 40-year-olds. It was hard. I mean, you could, of course, because the government did not succeed, but it was severely endangered. In fact, unfortunately, Maori is still an endangered language, despite the amazing public sphere activities. Most Maori are not speakers of Maori. They're not native speakers of Maori. That's very sad. Phonetically, what happened there was, don't forget one thing, Maori people have been in New Zealand for 700 years. As you know, they came from the Cook Islands in canoes, and every iwi, every Maori tribe is actually one canoe. Yeah, one canoe is a tribe, another canoe is another tribe. But eventually they had many dialects. So the Maori of Dunedin is very different from the Maori of Waitangi. But because of standardization, because this was actually very similar in a way to the Singaporean experience, you needed to standardize one Maori, just one Chinese in quotation marks. Doesn't matter that, as Terry said, Cantonese and Mandarin are totally different languages. I mean, it's not, you cannot understand Mandarin if you speak Cantonese and vice versa. I'm not talking about the writing. So what they did, they phonetically used the Roman script as opposed to what you see in Singapore in the case of Mandarin. And of course in Maori, there is a long vowel, so like Maori, it's an A with a bar, so it's a long. It's interesting because in Hawaii, Hawaii is related to Maori. So like aloha, aloha, in Hawaii. Aroha, love in Maori. It's the same word, right? Salofa, so it's all related. But in Hawaii, they forgot, the missionaries forgot the okina, which is the glottal stop. The glottal stop, which is pronounced they forgot it. So this is why we say Hawaii rather than Hawaii. There is a glottal stop in the middle. After Hawaii, you need to say a little bit like in Singaporean. Are you the one with the black bag becomes black bag? Like this glottal stop. So phoneticization using the Roman script is due to colonization. And of course, speakers of English are happy because it's much easier for, say, an English speaker to learn pinyin than to learn the 4,000 characters of Chinese, so you just learn the pinyin. So the same with Maori. Decolonization is a very important process that is happening right now. There is decolonization even of linguistics. So because linguistics, especially documentary linguistics, is supposed to be very kind of European and very much so decolonizing linguistics is like trying to analyze things from Maori/Aboriginal/Native Nations perspective. So yeah, absolutely, it is part of language revival, etc. There is this movement. But I am personally much more interested in grassroots activities led by native nations rather than in tokenistic kind of lip service, façon de parler activities that you find a lot in Australia. So in Australia, every event must open with a welcome to country by the, also in New Zealand, but in Australia there is a lot of tokenistic kind of lip service. It's not real. So I mean, you know, it's just like political correctness gone mad, so to speak. And I can show you many examples of, you know, you say welcome to country, and then the activity that the very same person did after that demonstrates that he or she could not care about that. So look, I mean, we should remember the important thing, and the important thing is belonging, well-being, and yeah, that's it.
I address to your second question because I've dealt with many different languages as well, both, and some of them, for example, the Litsu language in China. The early missionaries went there and they learned and they tried to capture that language, and because they were from UK, our Arabic alphabet is what they have. But then there's not enough sound. So if you pick up a Litsu language book, you will see all the alphabet, but you can see inverted E, inverted V, inverted L, because these are for sounds that sound like L, but yet it's slightly different from L. And then you have got double dot on top, you got this on top, and these are the different tone. So that if you learn these phonetics, you will be able to reproduce almost all the sounds that they have, including the tone. If you just use the phonetics itself, you will not be able to address the tone, and it could be very dangerous. You know, when I was in Thailand, I'm very careful about when I say my name, my surname K-E-E, because last time I just said I'm Terry Kee, and in Thailand when they say I'm Terry Kee, they laugh. Do you know why? Because in Thai, Kee means shit. All right? So when they say I'm Terry Kee, you know, it's like I'm calling myself shit, you know. So you know, you need to be aware of the language, and then the tone is right. And when you use just the phonetics, some languages is quite all right to use it, and there's no loss. But some languages, you lose certain sound and certain tone with the phonetics. But there's another thing in terms of is assumed. Take, for example, the English language, we just use the 26, the alphabet. But we have got the long and the short vowels. But for the native speakers, they know, even though it's not reflected in the written language, they use it. But Singaporeans, we don't differentiate between the long and the short vowels. And so very often, we just, it's like the machine gun. It's only short vowels, da, 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 da. And people who are not familiar with it, they couldn't get exactly what we are trying to say because we have cut off the long vowels in the English. Yeah.
I just want to say very quickly about spelling, because a lot of language revival, unfortunately, is wasted on spelling issues, and I am very much against this waste of time. Let us remind ourselves that Shakespeare spelled his surname in 5 different ways, none of which was Shakeespeare. Let us remind us that in 1976, there was the Australian Bureau of Statistics survey in which they asked you, what is your religion and what's your denomination? Presbyterian Christians spelled the word Presbyterian, guess in how many ways? Is there anybody? The word Presbyterian, how many spellings did Presbyterian Australians use when they spelled Presbyterian? This is before internet, and you know, you would be surprised, 383. 383 different ways of spelling Presbyterian by people who see the word Presbyterian every Sunday or whatever when they go to church. So this is not by Catholics, this is by Presbyterian. So spelling, it's not that important.
All right, I'm going to Google search later on. The lady, would you like to ask your question or your comments?
I would like to share your sentiments about language is our identity. by the way, good afternoon, everyone. Maayong hapon. Magandang hapon. So that's a Filipino, our national language, and my Ikigai, that's maayong hapon. I share with the sentiments that language is our identity, and once we lose it, then we lose our identity as well. And I don't know if everyone here knows about Philippines being colonized for over 330 years. Plus, we have Americans, we have Japanese and British. So we lose our writing system. And right now, we are restoring that writing system called Baybayin. And it's actually very beautiful writing. It's like phonetics, Phoenician origin. And I'd like to also share how would you say that at the point when the well-being is improved and there is social cohesion and harmony, that we are driving to restoring our writing system, our language, because we have 182 ethno-linguistics with 7,000 islands plus. So how will we then be, we can say that well-being is improved?
All right, in 2 minutes for each of you.
I would argue that the reward is in the journey. So it's not, there is no deadline. It's not like an exam at some universities or an assignment or whatever. The reward is in the journey, and there is only the tribe / the group / whatever you want to call it. It is their decision, firstly, to decide how far they would like to go. So some tribes, they say, we don't want fluent speech. We just want post-vernacular stage. A little bit like every Maori in New Zealand, every Jew in America, even if they are not native speakers of Maori Yiddish, they know 50 words in the language. So in New Zealand, it'd be whakapapa, which is heritage, matauranga, which is like knowledge, whanau, which is family. In America, Yiddish would be chutzpah, which is nerve, and schlep, which is like to go from one place to another. Every Jewish person, almost, I'm a linguist, I must generalize, because a language is an abstract ensemble of idiolects, sociolects. If there is a linguist who does not generalize, he's a spy. He's not a linguist. You must generalize, because language is a generalization. Nobody speaks the same language here. Nobody. Nobody speaks the very same language. Nobody. So coming back to America, 2 minutes, yeah? Coming back to America, you see, these people decided, okay, we are happy with post-vernacular stage. How to measure the well-being? We have our measurements, so we use psychological tests of happiness. So there are such things, devised, by the way, by indigenous people, some of them themselves. So you can look, I mean, if you're interested, you can email me and I can send you an article that I've recently published about exactly that. And there are ways. Another way is to look at education. Just like Andre from Morocco said this morning, you know, you see that Aboriginal people participating in language revival become better students at primary school and at secondary school, high school. So in other words, suddenly they're better in mathematics. Like mathematics is not related to the language, but they are just feeling better and they're more skilled, etc. So you see education improvement. You see less incarceration. You see less mental hospitalization. So there are some very clear indications of how the mental health is being improved.
Very quickly, I just want to say, for example, when You know, when I was in China and everybody looked the same, and as you're walking, and suddenly I hear somebody speak in Teochew. I got excited, I turned around to look, because here's somebody speak in Teochew. And I believe it's the same. You could be in Manila and you hear someone speak your tribal language. It will be, and then you meet, you're of the same tribe. When you speak to each other, suddenly you're like old friends. All right, the connection is there. And when you are able to speak your own language, somehow it gives you a rootedness into your history, your culture, your identity of who you are. And that itself, I think, is a very important anchor for your life, for your well-being. And at the same time, for example, when I was in Australia, I was in the supermarket, and suddenly I hear, I think two rows away, someone speaking in distinctively Singaporean accent, English. All right, I mean, in Australia they speak English, but here, the moment, hey, that must be a Malaysian or Singaporean. Then I begin to see who is that person. Are you from Singapore? Is it I'm from Malaysia? But close enough, we can start to converse. All right, there's a certain connectedness in the language. So that's why the more language you know and are familiar with, the better you are able to speak to others in the language of their heart. Take, for example, we have here one sister who, she's a Buddhist, and in Singapore, many of us speak Mandarin and English, and when we see each other, we speak in Teochew. Why? Because it's Teochew, we are Teochew. And there's a certain sense of connectedness that she's my sister, and that is what we're talking about, this sense of belonging. And this sense of belonging, two components is who we are, and we have multiple identity, and then and what language we can speak and converse with and understand. And some of us, we have more languages than the others. And both of these contribute to our being able to feel that we belong, or for them to accept us as one of them.
Language is visual, language is audible, and language is symbolic. And I guess that's kind of like the themes of today's 1.5 hour session. This is why we're in now, so that you can go for tea time, because I know food is more important sometimes, and well, it is the universal language in a way. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being such a wonderful audience, and thank you so much for those wonderful questions and comments. And please join me to thank Professor Gillard, Zuckerman, and Bishop Terry Kee.